My son-in-law shoved my wife's wheelchair down the porch steps and laughed about us. I said nothing. The next morning, I drove to his office and handed him a thick envelope. He opened it expecting a settlement check. He smiled that smug smile of his and said, "I knew you'd come around, old man." Then his face went white. Before I tell you what was inside, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, then drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. It matters more than you think. Now let me back up. I was 41 years married to Margaret when she had her first stroke. That was 2019. The second one came 18 months later, and after that she couldn't walk without help. I retired from the naval architecture firm I'd worked at since 1982, sold the boat, and turned the back bedroom of our house in Annapolis into something that looked more like a hospital ward than a place anyone would want to sleep. I didn't mind. Margaret had stood by me through 3 deployments and 2 miscarriages and 1 bad year where I drank too much, and I figured I owed her about 1,000 more years of the same. Our daughter Cordelia married a man named Brennan Kowalczyk in the spring of 2018. He was 34 years old, taller than me by a good 4 inches, and he sold commercial real estate up in Baltimore. He had a way of looking at our house, our furniture, even Margaret's wedding ring, that always reminded me of a man pricing out an estate sale. But Cordelia loved him, and I'd raised her to make her own decisions, so I shook his hand at the wedding and meant it. The first loan was $22,000. He came to me in October of 2022, sat at my kitchen table while Margaret slept in the next room, and told me he had a deal on a strip mall in Glen Burnie that was going to change everything. He needed earnest money. The bank was being slow. He'd pay me back inside 90 days with interest. I wrote the check. Margaret didn't know. I didn't see the point of bothering her with it. 90 days came and went. Then 6 months. Then a year. Every time I asked, there was a reason. The deal had restructured. The seller was being difficult. The bank had pulled financing. He promised to have something for me by Christmas, then by Easter, then by the 4th of July. I'm a patient man. But patience and being a fool aren't the same thing, and around the 18-month mark I started to suspect I'd been the latter. Then came the second loan, $11,000 for partnership buyout. I told him no. He smiled and told me he understood, and 3 weeks later Cordelia called me crying because Brennan had told her I wouldn't help them, and now they might lose their house. I wrote the check the next morning. I'm not proud of that. A man my age should know better than to be played by his own daughter. But Cordelia has Margaret's voice when she cries, and I've never been able to refuse Margaret anything either. By the spring of 2024, I had $33,000 out to a man who'd never returned a single penny, and a wife who was getting weaker every month, and a social security check that didn't stretch the way the cost of insulin and home health aides demanded. I started selling things. The boat went first. Then my father's pocket watch. Then the coin collection my grandfather started in 1947. I told myself it was just stuff. The Sunday it happened was Margaret's 73rd birthday. We planned a small thing. Cordelia and Brennan, my brother Theodore down from Pennsylvania, a neighbor or two. Margaret wanted to sit on the porch because the dogwoods were blooming, and she said the air smelled like the year we got married. I'd gotten her dressed in the blue cardigan she liked, and pushed her chair out to the front porch myself, locked the wheels, sat next to her on the wicker bench, and waited for company. Brennan and Cordelia arrived first. He came up the walk holding a small wrapped box in one hand, the other in his pocket. Cordelia looked exhausted, the way she always looked these days. Brennan kissed Margaret on the forehead and handed her the box and said something about how she looked beautiful, and Margaret smiled and thanked him, and for about 3 minutes, everything was the way it was supposed to be. Then Brennan turned to me and asked, casual as you please, if we could speak privately. I told him whatever he wanted to say, he could say in front of his wife and his mother-in-law. He didn't like that. His jaw did the thing it does, that little sideways grind, and he said, fine, he was fronting capital on a development project in Pasadena and needed $45,000 by Tuesday, or he was going to be in serious trouble. $45,000. On Margaret's birthday, with my wife sitting 2 feet away in a wheelchair she'd never get out of. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I looked at Cordelia, who was studying her shoes. And I said no. Not no with explanation. Not no with explanation. Not no with regret. Just no. He took a step toward me. I'm not a small man, but I'm 68 years old, and my left knee doesn't bend the way it used to. And Brennan knew that. He leaned down close to my face and said, low enough that Cordelia couldn't hear, that I owed him for keeping his mouth shut about how I'd let Margaret get this bad, that a real husband would have caught the first stroke earlier, that she was sitting in that chair because of me. I didn't see his hand move. I saw Margaret's chair tip. I heard the wheels unlock, which they shouldn't have because I'd locked them myself. And then I saw my wife of 46 years go backwards down 4 wooden steps and land on the brick walkway with a sound I will hear in my dreams until the day I die. Brennan said, oops. That's what he said. Not Jesus, not Margaret, not anything a human being would say. Just oops and a little laugh like he'd spilled something. Cordelia screamed. I was already moving, but I'm slow, and by the time I got down the steps, Margaret was unconscious with blood coming out of her ear. She lived. I want to tell you that right now because the rest of this story is hard enough. Margaret lived. She broke her hip and her right wrist, and she had a concussion that took her a long time to come back from, but she lived. The ambulance got there in 11 minutes. The paramedic was a young woman named Jocelyn, who I will remember the rest of my life. Because while Margaret was being lifted onto the gurney, Brennan stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets and told the EMTs that the brake on her chair must have been faulty. I didn't say a word. I didn't say a word in the ambulance. I didn't say a word at the hospital while they x-rayed my wife. I didn't say a word when Brennan came to the waiting room with 2 coffees and tried to hand me one. I didn't say a word when Cordelia sat down next to me and asked if I was okay. I just stared at the wall and counted, in my head, the things I needed to do. The first thing I did when I got home at 2 in the morning with Margaret still in surgery was open my laptop and pull up the footage from the Ring camera I'd installed last year after some kids had been stealing packages off porches in our neighborhood. I'd forgotten about it, honestly. Margaret had been complaining about the notifications, and I turned them off and stopped thinking about it. But the camera had been running. The camera had been running for 14 months without me checking it once. The footage showed everything. Brennan leaning down to my face, his right foot, the one closest to the wheelchair, casually flicking the brake lever up. His hand on the back of the chair. The push, which was not a push, exactly more like a nudge, the kind of small motion a man uses when he wants something out of his way. Margaret's chair tipping, Margaret's body going backwards. Brennan's face in the second after, which was not surprise. It was satisfaction. I watched it 3 times, then I sat in the dark of my kitchen for about an hour. Then I picked up the phone and called a man I hadn't spoken to in 12 years. Russell Akhtar had been my attorney back in the late 90s, when our firm was sued by a contractor in Norfolk. He was in his 60s now, and he answered on the 3rd ring even though it was past 3 in the morning, because that's the kind of man Russell is. I told him what had happened, slow and clear, and when I was done there was a long silence on the line, and then he said, "Are you somewhere safe?" I told him I was at home. He told me to lock the doors and not to talk to anyone except my daughter and the police until he saw me at his office at 9. He told me not to confront Brennan. He told me, twice, not to confront Brennan. I said I understood. I meant it at the time. The next morning I drove to Russell's office in downtown Annapolis, and I sat across his desk, and I showed him the footage on my phone, and I watched his face go through the same thing. My face had gone through the night before. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Walter, this isn't an accident. This is attempted murder." I didn't argue. I didn't have the strength to argue. He told me what we were going to do. We were going to file a police report that morning. We were going to download the footage to 3 separate drives. We were going to talk to the hospital social worker about getting documentation of Margaret's injuries. And we were not, under any circumstances, going to tip Brennan off until the warrant was issued. I agreed to all of it, and then I drove straight to Brennan's office in Baltimore. I want to be honest about why. Russell told me later that I'd put the entire case at risk, that I'd nearly given Brennan time to flee. That of all the things I could have done that morning, what I did was the dumbest. He was right. He was absolutely right. But I had been sitting in that hospital room watching a respiratory therapist suction blood out of my wife's airway, and I needed Brennan to know what was coming. I needed to look at him and let him think for one more day that he had won, so that when the moment came, the fall would be longer. His office was on the 8th floor of a glass building near the Inner Harbor. I'd been there once before, 3 years ago, when he'd given Cordelia and me a tour after his promotion. I now know he wasn't a partner. He'd been a junior associate the whole time, and he'd been let go 6 months before Margaret's birthday for billing irregularities. Cordelia didn't know that either. I walked into the lobby with a manila envelope in my hand. The receptionist recognized me and called up to him without my asking. He came out of his corner office grinning and shook my hand like nothing had happened. He led me back to his desk and sat down and gestured at the chair across from him. I sat. I put the envelope on the desk between us. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. He said, "Walter, I knew you'd see it my way." He said, "I'm sorry about yesterday. The chair was old. Things happen. Family is family." He said, "How much did you bring?" I told him to open it. He picked it up and ran his thumb under the flap and pulled out what was inside. It was not a check. It was not cash. It was a stack of 43 pages, double-sided, in a binder clip. The top page was a still frame from my Ring camera, time-stamped 2:47 p.m. the previous afternoon, showing his foot on the brake lever of Margaret's wheelchair. The second page was the next frame. The third was the next. The next 40 pages were a complete second-by-second sequence of what he had done. The last page was a notarized statement from Russell Akhtar, attorney at law, indicating that the original digital files were in the possession of 3 independent custodians and the Anne Arundel County Police Department. He stared at it. His mouth opened. No sound came out. He flipped through the pages once, fast, then again, slower. He set the stack down on his desk and looked up at me. I stood up. I said, "Brennan, I just wanted you to know who's coming." I walked out. I rode the elevator down to the lobby. I got in my car. I drove 3 blocks before I had to pull over, because I couldn't see through the tears, and I sat in a Wendy's parking lot for 45 minutes and cried like I hadn't cried since my mother died in 1998. The warrant was issued at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Brennan was arrested at his apartment at 6. He'd already been on the phone with 3 attorneys. Russell told me later that he'd also withdrawn $19,000 in cash from his account between 2 and 4, which would later become Exhibit C. The next morning, my phone started ringing and didn't stop. The first call was from Cordelia. She was sobbing. She said the police had taken Brennan and she didn't understand, and what was happening and how could I do this to her family. I let her talk. When she was done, I told her, calmly, to come to the hospital. I told her there was something she needed to see. I met her in the family lounge on the surgical floor. Margaret was still sedated. I had the laptop. I played the footage for my daughter. She watched it once. Then she walked into the bathroom and threw up. Then she came back out and watched it again. Then she sat down in a chair and didn't speak for almost an hour. Finally, she said, "He told me," she rolled. "He told me the brake failed. He told me you were going to blame him." I said, "I know." She said, "He told me you've been sliding into dementia, that you were forgetting things, that you were dangerous." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Daddy, I'm so sorry." I held her while she cried. She is 41 years old and she cried like she was 7 and had broken something she couldn't fix. I told her I loved her. I told her none of this was her fault. I told her none of this was her fault. I told her mother was going to be okay. I lied about the last one because I didn't know yet, but I needed her to hear it. The next 2 months were the worst of my life, and I've lived through some bad ones. Margaret went into rehab and didn't recognize me for 6 days. Brennan made bail and immediately filed a countersuit alleging I had assaulted him in his office, which was thrown out within a week, but cost us $7,000 in legal fees anyway. Cordelia moved into our guest room with 2 suitcases and didn't unpack them for 3 weeks because she kept thinking she was going home. And the calls started. Not from Brennan. From other people. The first one came from a woman named Tatansto in Hagerstown. She'd seen the local news coverage of the arrest, and she'd recognized Brennan's name. He'd taken $19,000 from her in 2021, she said, for a real estate investment that didn't exist. He'd dated her briefly while doing it. She'd never gotten the money back, and she'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone, including her grown children. She was 62, and she was a widow, and she had wired him her late husband's life insurance. The second call was from a man in Wilmington. The third was from a woman in Towson. By the end of the month, Russell had compiled a list of 14 people Brennan had defrauded over the previous 6 years. 11 of them were widows or widowers over 60. 4 of them had given him more than $50,000. 2 of them had lost their houses. One of them, a retired school principal named Doris in Salisbury, had given Brennan $26,000 in 2023 because he'd told her my wife Margaret was dying of pancreatic cancer and needed an experimental treatment our insurance wouldn't cover. He'd shown her doctored medical paperwork. He'd told her Margaret didn't want me to know how sick she was. Doris had given him every cent of her savings because she'd lost her own husband to pancreatic cancer in 2017, and she said she couldn't bear the thought of another woman dying the way Walter had. I drove to Salisbury to meet her. She was 81 years old. She lived in an apartment over a hair salon. When I told her my wife was alive, that she was recovering from a fall, that she had never had cancer of any kind, Doris started laughing. Just laughing. She laughed for almost a full minute. Then she put her face in her hands and she said, "Oh, thank God. Oh, thank God she's alive." She didn't cry about her money. She cried about Margaret being alive, a woman she'd never met, whose fictional death she had paid $26,000 to prevent. I sat in her kitchen for 2 hours. She made me tea. She showed me photographs of her late husband, a Navy man like me, who'd served on the same class of destroyer I'd helped design in the 80s. She told me she'd be a witness. She told me she'd drive to Annapolis on her own dime. She told me she'd say in a court of law exactly what Brennan Kowalczyk had done. 8 others said the same thing. By the time we got to the preliminary hearing in late June, Russell had 9 sworn affidavits and 3 witnesses prepared to testify in person. The state's attorney's office took over the case from the local prosecutor and added wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and aggravated assault to the existing charges. But the case I cared about was the assault on Margaret. That was a state charge, and it depended on the video and on one other thing, the testimony of an eyewitness. And the only eyewitness besides me was my daughter. Cordelia agonized over it for weeks. She had loved Brennan. Some part of her, I think, still did. She knew now what he had done to her mother and to all those other women. But knowing and being able to stand in a courtroom and say it out loud are different things. Russell didn't pressure her. I didn't pressure her. We waited. She came into my study one Tuesday night in July. Margaret was asleep down the hall. Cordelia sat in the leather chair across from my desk, the one she used to sit in when she was a little girl, and wanted to ask me something serious. She looked about 10 years old. She said, "Daddy, I keep thinking about what kind of mother I'm going to be." I said, "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She said, "I don't have kids yet, but I will someday. And someday they're going to ask me what I did when their grandmother got hurt. And I have to be able to tell them I did the right thing. I have to be able to tell them I told the truth." She testified on August 14th. She walked into that courtroom in a navy blue dress I'd never seen before, and she sat in that witness box, and she looked her husband in the eye, and she described what she had seen on her mother's birthday. She described the conversation, she described the break, she described the laugh. She described the words, "Oops." When the defense attorney cross-examined her, he asked if she was perhaps mistaken, given the emotional state she'd been in. He asked if she was perhaps angry at her husband for unrelated reasons. He asked if she was perhaps influenced by her father, who had a history of disliking her husband. She said, "I'm not mistaken. I'm not confused. I watched my husband try to kill my mother because she sat next to a man who wouldn't give him money, and I did nothing for 30 seconds because I couldn't believe it was happening. And I will live with that for the rest of my life, but I'm not going to live with lying about it too." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with guilty on the assault charge, guilty on 2 of the 4 fraud charges, and a recommendation for the maximum sentence on the elder abuse enhancement. The judge gave him 11 years. He'll be eligible for parole in 7. With good behavior, 6. I'm 68 years old. By the time he gets out, I will be 74 if I'm lucky. Margaret will be 79. We may not be here. I have made my peace with that. The point was never that he would go to prison forever. The point was that he would go, and that he would go with the world knowing what he was, and that 9 other women in 3 states would have their day in court, and that my daughter would be able to sleep at night. Margaret came home from rehab in September. She walks with a frame now. Slowly, but she walks. She didn't remember the fall for a long time, and I didn't tell her. Cordelia and I agreed she didn't need to know. But she figured it out eventually. Margaret was always sharper than I gave her credit for. One evening in October, she asked me point blank if Brennan had pushed her down the steps. I told her the truth. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "Walter, I want you to do something for me." I said, "Anything." She said, "I want you to forgive Cordelia. Not later. Now, out loud. Out loud. Now, out loud. So she hears it." I told her I already had. She said it didn't matter. She said our daughter needed to hear the words. So I went to the guest room where Cordelia had been living for 6 months by then, and I sat on the bed next to her, and I told her she was forgiven, for not seeing it sooner, for believing him, for the lies she had told me about my own mind, for everything. She cried. I cried. Margaret was in the doorway, leaning on her frame, and she was crying too. The 3 of us sat in that room for a long time, and nobody said anything else. And the late afternoon light came through the window the same way it had 100,000 other afternoons of my life. I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'll stop. About a month after the verdict, I got a letter from Doris in Salisbury. The court had ordered restitution from Brennan seized assets, and she'd received a check for $19,000. She wrote that she didn't need the money. She was 81, and her late husband's pension covered her bills, and she had no children. She was sending the check to me, she said, because she wanted me to use it for Margaret's care. I called her and told her I couldn't accept it. She told me I had to. She said she'd been ready to die alone in her apartment, ashamed, blaming herself, and that I had given her something she couldn't give herself, which was the chance to stop hating an old woman who had been kind enough to a stranger to lose her savings. She said the money meant nothing now. The dignity was what she was paying for. She told me to take the check and shut up about it. I took the check. I used it to buy Margaret a better wheelchair, one with electric assist, the kind she'd been embarrassed to ask for. The first time she rolled it out onto the porch on a cold November morning, she looked up at me from underneath her wool hat and she said, "Walter, look, I'm flying. I want to leave you with this. People will ask me sometimes whether it was worth it, whether the courtroom and the lawyers and the months of hell and the fact that my daughter still wakes up some nights crying for a man she shouldn't even remember the name of, whether all of that was worth what we got out of it. And the honest answer is that I don't know. I don't think justice and revenge are the same thing, but I'm not always sure I can tell them apart anymore. What I know is that an old woman in Salisbury sleeps better, What I know is that my wife is on the porch this morning watching the Cardinals at the feeder. What I know is that the man who put her in that chair is sitting in a state correctional facility outside Hagerstown, and that 9 women he stole from will live the rest of their lives knowing somebody believed them. That has to be enough. Some days it is. Some days it isn't. But I get up every morning, and I make Margaret her coffee the way she likes it, 2 creams and 1 sugar, and I push her chair out onto the porch, and I sit next to her, and we watch the birds. And that, I think, is what they meant by the long way home. If this story moved you, hit that like button, and please subscribe for more stories from people like me. Tell me in the comments what you would have done the morning after. I read everyone. Take care of the people who love you, and lock your wheels. I've spent a lot of nights since that birthday on the porch, wondering how a man like Brennan grows in the middle of a family like ours. I don't have a clean answer. What I have is a suspicion, and the suspicion is that he didn't grow there. He arrived with the rot already inside him, and we, every one of us, gave him soil. I gave him the first check when something in my gut told me not to. Cordelia gave him her trust when his stories stopped lining up. Even Margaret, who never met a stranger she couldn't read, smiled and called him a good provider, because she wanted our daughter to be happy. We all watered something we should have starved. That is the part of this I cannot let myself forget. Cause and effect doesn't only apply to the man who hurts you. It applies to the people who decide, again and again, to look the other way. Every yes I gave Brennan was a small vote for the next thing he would do. Every excuse Cordelia made for him was a sandbag against her own intuition. None of us pulled his hand. But none of us pulled it back either, until it was already in motion above my wife's head. The lesson I have taken from all of it has 3 parts, and I'd like to leave them with you in the order I learned them. The first is moral. You owe your loved ones the truth, even when the truth costs you the holiday, the family photo, the easy Sunday. Politeness in the face of cruelty is not kindness. It is permission with better manners. If something feels wrong inside your house, name it, out loud, while the room is still small. The second is intellectual. Pay attention. Keep records. Watch the patterns, not the speeches. Brennan was very good with words and very bad with money, and for years I let the words do the work that the numbers should have been doing. I am a man who used to draw ship hulls for a living, and I forgot that the math always tells you what the man is really up to, long before his mouth does. Trust the math. Trust the receipts. Trust the small inconsistencies. They are never small. The third is the hardest, and it is about endurance. There will come a morning when you are sitting in a hospital waiting room or a kitchen at 3 a.m., and you will have to decide whether you are the kind of person who acts or the kind who explains why he didn't. Nobody is born knowing the answer. You find it the morning it is required of you. I am 68 years old, and I found mine on a wicker bench next to an empty wheelchair, and I will tell you, friend, it is never too late to start. The man who pushed Margaret is in a cell tonight. My wife is asleep down the hall, and I am still here, learning,